In the previous video, we discussed how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I. However, as we also noted, the enormous scale of the conflict seems out of proportion to the event that set it in motion. Franz Ferdinand was not especially popular, even within Austria-Hungary, so his death alone cannot explain why Europe plunged into war. The assassination was not the true cause of the conflict. It was merely the spark that ignited it. For decades, Europe had been accumulating political tensions, rivalries, and fears, creating an increasingly unstable situation. Once the spark was struck, the resulting explosion was almost impossible to prevent. Historians have developed numerous long-term causes for the conflict. These forces acted like charges of dynamite waiting to explode, and together they help explain why a single assassination in Sarajevo could trigger a global war. Nationalism had been steadily growing throughout the 19th century, shaping the way Europeans viewed both themselves and their neighbours. It encouraged intense pride in one's own nation, fostered suspicion and rivalry toward other countries, and promoted the belief that a nation's strength could be measured through its willingness and ability to wage war. At the same time, the popularity of social Darwinism applied Charles Darwin's ideas about competition and survival to human societies and nations. Many Europeans came to believe that countries, like species in nature, survived and prospered only by defeating weaker rivals. As a result, war was increasingly portrayed by some political leaders, intellectuals, and military thinkers not as a disaster to be avoided, but as a necessary test of national vitality, strength, and fitness. This combination of aggressive nationalism and social Darwinist thinking helped create a climate in which international conflict appeared not only acceptable but, to some, inevitable. European powers, especially Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, were engaged in intense competition for colonies and influence around the world. By the early 20th century, Britain possessed the largest empire in history, with territories spanning every continent, while France controlled extensive colonial holdings in Africa and Asia. Russia continued to expand its influence into Central Asia, and Germany, having unified later than its rivals, sought its own colonial empire and what Kaiser Wilhelm II called a place in the sun. This struggle for overseas territories heightened tensions among the great powers, as each nation viewed imperial expansion as a measure of national strength and prestige. As a result, the gain of territory or influence by one empire was often perceived as a direct threat to the interests of another. These imperial rivalries fostered distrust, intensified diplomatic disputes, and contributed to the growing hostility that pushed Europe closer to war. Militarism was the belief that a nation's strength and security depended primarily on military power, and that military solutions were often more effective than diplomatic ones. By 1914, nearly every major European power, especially Germany, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, had embraced this mindset. Governments invested heavily in massive standing armies, relied on compulsory military service to create large reserve forces, and devoted enormous sums of money to military expansion. The lessons of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 reinforced these priorities. Because Prussia had achieved a swift victory through rapid mobilization and overwhelming manpower, European leaders concluded that success in any future war would depend on the ability to raise and deploy the largest army as quickly as possible. As a result, detailed mobilization plans became central to national defense strategies. Militarism was further intensified by the fierce naval arms race between Germany and Britain. Determined to challenge British naval supremacy, Germany invested heavily in the construction of powerful battleships, prompting Britain to respond with an even larger shipbuilding program. The competition produced unprecedented levels of military spending and technological development as both nations sought to outbuild the other's fleet. This naval rivalry heightened tensions between the two powers and contributed to a broader atmosphere of suspicion and hostility throughout Europe. By 1914, military preparedness had become such a priority that many leaders viewed war not as an avoidable failure of diplomacy, but as an increasingly likely, and perhaps even necessary, test of national power. To maintain security in an increasingly militarized Europe, Nations formed a network of binding alliances designed to deter potential enemies and strengthen their own positions. The logic behind these agreements was straightforward. If a country could not defeat its rivals alone, it should join forces with powerful allies. Over time, this strategy divided Europe into two major blocs. The Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, although Italy's commitment would later prove uncertain, while the Triple Entente united France, Russia, and Britain. Beyond these major powers, smaller states were also drawn into the system. Russia pledged support to Serbia. Britain guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium, and France was committed to backing Russia in the event of war. While these alliances were intended to preserve peace through mutual deterrence, they also created a rigid and fragile international structure. A conflict involving one nation could quickly obligate others to intervene, turning a local dispute into a much larger confrontation. As a result, Europe became increasingly vulnerable to a chain reaction of military commitments. When the crisis in Sarajevo erupted in the summer of 1914, the alliance system transformed what might have remained a regional conflict between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia into a continent-wide war. The very alliances designed to maintain stability instead helped spread the conflict across Europe, demonstrating how interconnected and volatile the international system had become. Newspapers played a significant role in increasing international tensions during the years leading up to World War I. A style of reporting known as yellow journalism emphasized sensational and often exaggerated stories designed to attract readers and boost newspaper sales rather than provide careful and balanced reporting. Across Europe, many newspapers turned relatively minor diplomatic disputes into major crises, portrayed rival nations as dangerous and aggressive enemies, glorified military strength and the prospect of war, and encouraged feelings of fear, anger, and intense patriotism among their readers. By constantly highlighting international rivalries and presenting conflicts in dramatic terms, the press helped create a climate in which many people came to see war as both inevitable and desirable. Like many forms of mass media, newspapers depended on attracting audiences and generating revenue, and sensational stories proved highly effective at selling papers. As a result, the pursuit of readership often intensified public hostility between nations and made diplomatic crises more difficult to resolve peacefully.